Are we live? Good. Muy buenas noches y bienvenidos. Welcome to tonight's presentation by His Excellency Carlos Salinas de Gortari of his new book, Mexico, The Politics of Modernization. It's not one you'll carry on a trip lightly, but it will be, I guarantee you, worth your while. By the way, we will take questions at the end of the speech by His Excellency. You all have these little cards, I believe, you picked up on the way in. And members of the Rice Student Ambassadors will come by when you have a question and you filled out the card. And members of the Rice Student Ambassadors, most of them are dressed in blue shirts, will come by and pick up your card and bring them up here, and we will try to respond to as many as we can at the end of his presentation. There's a Mexican poet by the name of Luis Urbina, and he crafted a poem, In Marcha al Ideal, the march to the ideal. And there he says, que lo que ayer fue anhelo mañana será Alá. Which was yesterday a wish will tomorrow be a wing. Mexico's march to modernization is ongoing, but the difficult transition from wish to wing was greatly facilitated by our guest this evening. Carlos Salinas' connection with the United States began early and very auspiciously because his elementary school was named after the greatest American ever, Abraham Lincoln. After graduating from the Universidad Nacional Autonomía de Mexico in 1969, he traveled north to Harvard. Actually, I was teaching economics at Harvard while you were a graduate student there. There he received a Master of Public Administration and in 1978, a PhD in government. His talents were very quickly put to use on his return to Mexico. He served in various government posts until in 1981, he joined the President Miguel de la Madrid's cabinet as Minister of Planning and Budget. There he employed many friends of mine. He was elected president himself in 1988, and he served until 1994. He initiated a series of economic policy reforms, a difficult series, just as soon as he took office, began to do so. Land distribution rules were modernized, wage and price controls were dismantled, government-owned businesses in several sectors were privatized, and many restrictions on foreign business ownership were lifted. Mexico's foreign debt burden was eased in 1989 when the country came to an agreement with its creditors under the well-known Brady Plan. The agreement eventually reduced Mexico's debt payments by about $8 billion a year, quite an achievement. His government was also remarkably successful in taming raging inflation from 160% per year down to only 10% by 1993, virtual price stability for Latin America at the time. Mr. Salinas long nourished a dream of a free trade zone in this hemisphere. This dream was realized, at least for the North, in the Northern Hemisphere, in North America, in 1992 when he and President George H. Bush and Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney signed the historic North American Free Trade Agreement. His efforts to reform the Mexican economy were hard-won. There are very few people who have superior first-hand knowledge of the challenges and the difficulties, as well as the benefits of modernization. So please join me in welcoming our guest tonight, His Excellency Carlos Salinas, Presidente de Mexico for 6 eventful and fruitful years.
I want to thank you very much, President Giles, for his very warm and encouraging remarks, and certainly for the hospitality of Rice University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the United States. I feel honored to be at the James Baker Institute for Public Policy, and certainly to have the privilege of having Secretary Baker here tonight because what I'm going to talk about is something that he knows very well because he was part of what was built in the new type of relationship between Mexico and the US. The purpose of my presence here, yes, is to present a book that talks about the past and also gives a basis to think about the future. When you go to Washington, D.C., and you enter the National Archives, there are two columns on the entrance. The one on the left states, "Study the past." The one on the right states, "Because what is past is prologue." And that is precisely what my intention is to present here. Reflections on the past and also basis to think with the wings of knowledge open about the future. And I believe this is a proper moment to speak about these issues, especially once we have faced a new world transformation on the being. What happened on September the 11th of last year here in the United States was an act that shocked us Mexicans and millions of people in the world. Our solidarity on those tragic days and in the months past have been there, and also our rage at those events. But precisely because a new world transformation is emerging from that event, is that I believe that it's important to reflect on the previous great world transformation, and precisely here in Houston. Because we Mexicans faced what was the biggest challenge at the end of the 1980s, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, with a new type of relationship with our great neighbor to the north. When we decided to embrace this new type of relationship, we went forward with the proposal of establishing the biggest, largest free trade area in the world, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And let me tell you that the initiative for this agreement was born here in Houston in November of 1988. On that occasion, the President-elect of the United States, George Bush, met with the President-elect of Mexico, Carlos Salinas. It only happens every 12 years that the inaugurations of both administrations coincide, and so happened in 1988 as it happened in 2000 as well. On that meeting in November of '88, I had the opportunity to meet a man of vision, determination, and with the will to develop a new type of relationship with its neighbor to the south. I found in President Bush, then President-elect, the willingness to open the door to a relationship that would not be looking so much to the tensions of the past, which we all remember, but mostly to the opportunities of the future. And on that occasion, we spoke about the issues, the many issues of the very complex relationship between our two countries, the war on drugs, border circumstances, the environment, but two issues stood out among them all. One was the excessive debt that Mexico had got in the previous decade, and which we required to be reduced in order to recover the rates of economic growth. And we spoke at length on that issue, and I was very pleased to get the full support of then President-elect Bush on our proposal to reduce the debt. But during the conversation here in Houston, President Bush spoke frankly, and he said, President Salinas, it would be good for both countries to have a free trade agreement. And I said no. No, because I considered that having two huge negotiations going on simultaneously was too much to handle for us. and whatever we might get on debt reduction, we might have to give away on trade concessions. So we had to wait. But the proposal was there. And there was a man during that very warm and frank discussion who stood up in favor of the proposals that were being made. Secretary Baker was then present at the creation, at the very moment when the idea of NAFTA was put forward. Finally, we were able to finish the debt negotiation, and at the end of 1989, the first year of my administration, I traveled to Europe at the beginning of 1990. And what I found was that debt reduction was not enough to get Mexico in the path of development and growth. The world had changed. Precisely at the end of that year, 1989, we faced the enormous transformation of geopolitical realities with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and as Mr. Baker very aptly wrote it in his book, The Politics of Diplomacy, the end of the Cold War, with his meeting with Mr. Shevardnadze in an airport in Moscow during those fateful days, those were historical moments and years. And for us Mexicans, we had to face the new realities. And it so happened that while being at Davos in January of 1990, I found out that in spite of Mexico having reduced its debt, it didn't attract enough flow of financial funds to the country. And the reason was crystal clear. There was a fascination with the changes in Central and Eastern Europe. So we had to take a new, bold, and different step. So at the end of January, I knocked on one of my cabinet members' door at the hotel we were staying at Davos. He didn't answer the knock, he was asleep. So I entered the room very slowly, and I woke him up and told him, you have to go and meet the US trade representative who is precisely here in Davos. He was Jaime Serra, she was Carla Hills. The next morning, Jaime Serra hurriedly came looking for Carla Hills, and he said, listen, the Mexican government has decided to initiate the negotiation for a free trade agreement with the US. And let me tell you that when Jaime Serra returned, he was quite phased. And I said, why, Jaime? You must be very encouraged by the response of Ambassador Hills. He said, no, because she said that the US was mostly interested in the Uruguay round of multilateral trade agreements. And I said, don't worry, Jaime. She is a very talented negotiator. She's already begun the negotiation with you. So what I decided then was to call personally President Bush, and we began this very careful process of going on the building of NAFTA. This was a tremendous change in the way Mexico dealt with its mighty neighbor to the north. Because in the past, in the 19th century, when some people tried to build the railroad between the border at Laredo and Mexico City, there was a Mexican president who said, we have had so many bad moments in the relationship that instead of the railroads, I prefer the sand of the desert to be between Mexico and the US. And later on, another Mexican president said, on the difficulty of this relationship, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the US. This was the type of mentalities that we had to change. By the way, when I told these reflections to a friend of mine, the governor of the Bank of Israel, Michael Bruno, he said, Mr. President, it's very peculiar because here in Israel we say the reverse. And I asked, what do you mean? Yes, we say, poor Israel, so close to God and so far from the US. But nevertheless, it's a matter of geopolitical realities. And ours is the one we were facing and the one we were trying to change. And to propose NAFTA was precisely to approach the relationship on a different footing, one of respect, one of not forgetting the historical realities that we had gone through, but also one that tried to build this relationship on mutual benefit. And the response from President Bush was a very enthusiastic one. And he considered it so important that several members of his cabinet, key in the political process of the US, came into playing within the process of negotiation. Among them, precisely, Secretary of State Baker and his very able assistant, Mr. Selig, who played such an important role in the process of convincing now the US representatives and senators that it was good to have this closer relationship with its neighbor to the south. When we began the dialogue on the perspective of NAFTA, we found that it was very important to build first, in my responsibility, a consensus in Mexico and simultaneously a consensus in favor of NAFTA in the US. And I found myself in the very special position as President of Mexico of being asked by the President of the US to come to his great country and promote the idea of the agreement, mainly among the legislators, to pass the so-called fast-track authority. So we became allies in the process of getting the fast-track approval at the House of Representatives and in general in the US Congress. It was a very tough battle, an uphill battle, very difficult, but at the end, it's evident we were successful. Once we ended it, we became adversaries at the negotiating table, one government facing the other. But we were able to negotiate intensely for more than 2 years, and when we finally reached the conclusion of the agreement at the end of 1992, we were able to strike, along with Canada and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, precisely what we call a win-win-win agreement for the benefits that it would bring for the three countries. When I promoted the costs for NAFTA here in the US, I insisted that for development in my country to go forward, we wanted trade and not aid. And we preferred to export goods and not people. Because if we were able to create enough employment opportunities along the country, what we required was the liberalization of the markets between our countries in order to gain precisely the momentum we require to promote economic growth. When Mexicans first heard about the possibility of negotiating NAFTA, there was an understandable reaction of caution and mistrust. But we were able to explain the benefits of this new type of relationship with the US. And let me tell you that the response was very positive, and at the end, even enthusiastic. Some Mexicans worried that the size of the American economy would be so overwhelming for the Mexican economy that it might, at the end, possibly swallow us. We always answered that it was a battle of productivity and also of complementarity more than of competition. But that if there was anyone who should worry, it was in the field of culture that the Americans should worry, because we Mexicans had 3,000 years of culture behind us. And that strength and that influence in this great country is what, let's say, not worry them, but they should pay attention to that. And when I heard that at the Super Bowl, they ate more avocado than pizza, it showed the difference in the guacamole that the culture was making its penetration in American everyday life. Just to mention an example, not to talk about bilingual electoral campaigns in this country. But nevertheless, there was the strength of our country, the strength of the US, and when finally NAFTA was ratified, then with the support of the Clinton administration in the US Congress at the end of 1993, it was the results that proved us all that we were right in our proposal. When we were designing some modeling on the benefits of a possible NAFTA, the most optimistic projections spoke about the possibility of bringing Mexican exports from 16 billion per year to around 40 billion per year. And that really sounded a tremendous improvement and increase. Today, Mexican exports are almost $200 billion to the US. And that shows the importance for Mexico of NAFTA. And especially so if you consider that after the 1995 economic crisis in Mexico, the analysis have proved that our economy was able to recover faster thanks precisely to NAFTA. And last year, Mexico was the first or second biggest receptor of foreign funds in any country in the world, precisely because of the trade agreement, which at the end was not only a trade agreement, but a financial agreement as well. But on the US side, what we found through all these years while NAFTA has been working on was that the competitiveness of industrial activities in the US grew immensely, because this increase in trade relations was mostly in intra-industry trade, which means, for example, the automobile industry in the US got more competitive thanks to the links it established with its plants in Mexico. And thus, we were all able to benefit from the trade relationship, so much increase thanks precisely to NAFTA. So these were the main elements that gave us the opportunity to develop this new type of relationship between the two countries, one which we always emphasize had to consider first and above all the principle of sovereignty. We live in a world of globalization. Many people in different places are talking about the end of the principle of sovereignty, not for us, Mexicans, because for us the most important thing is precisely that, to remain as Mexicans. But we also prove that it is possible to sustain the principle of sovereignty and at the same time strengthen the relationship with the only superpower in the world. And let me tell you that in the process of promoting NAFTA, there was one community that played a very important role here in the US in explaining the benefits of the agreement, and that was the Mexican-American community, which was always mostly on the side in favor of the agreement because they knew that their very important heritage south of the border would play a very important role in opening opportunities, business opportunities for their own community, cultural avenues of expressing their new reality in this country. And I was very, very proud and respectful of that great Mexican-American community that played such an important role during the whole process of the negotiation. This is, NAFTA is the first part on the book. It's 200 pages out of the 1,400 pages that you can read in the book. So it talks about some of the things. Because the process of modernization is precisely that, change, and it's the reaction to change. Whenever you introduce transformations, you must know that there will be a reaction from the interests affected by that process of change. So it's a constant struggle. That's why politics is always present. Politics in its best expression as the means to build consensus. And the policy was right, the politics had to be there to be part of this whole process towards the principles that we have established through the proposal we made through social liberalism. This brought us not only the process of economic reform, in the field of foreign relations, in political reform by opening the electoral system to the competition of all parties and ending the control of the government and the precisely on the electoral process, and the social aspect to promote rural reform, as it was said, and also educational reform, because that was the only way to increase the competitiveness of our country and also to improve income distribution. It's very well known that higher education, better income distribution, and certainly to promote the solidarity program that play such an important role in the strategy we had to bring together economic and political reform with the social programs that would allow the Mexican population to improve their standards of living with their own effort, in their own hands, and through the organization of their own communities. While we were negotiating NAFTA, our friends in the rest of Latin America reacted in two different ways. Some of them said that Mexico was turning its back towards Latin America because it was looking north. But most of them said, go all the way. Get the agreement because that's the way we want to go. And that's the way we know we must go if we want to be able to create the opportunities that our countrymen demand. So I was very pleased that there was this support in Latin America for NAFTA and also for free trade. Even before NAFTA, we were able to reach the first ever free trade agreement, the one between Mexico and Chile, with President Patricio Aylwin, a beacon of democracy and a man committed to the modernization of his country. And also with Colombia and Venezuela, Bolivia and Costa Rica. And it showed that we were capable of bringing all of them together in the path of free trade, and at the same time, while we negotiated NAFTA, we left a clause which explicitly stated that it was open to the accession of any other country that fulfilled the requirements of opening their economies and going the way that NAFTA had established. This was very encouraging then. It's very worrisome today because we Mexicans look at our brothers and sisters in the rest of Latin America with worrisome because the winds of populism are reviving in the region. And that's where the memory of the past must be very much alive today. Populism hurt the region so much that we are not over yet from the effects that it caused on the everyday lives of many people there. We hear very often that the problems of today come precisely from liberalization. This is a misguided diagnosis. The opening of markets with social programs and the promotion of democracy is precisely the way in which the results show that respond to the expectations of the community. And merely to distort the diagnosis perhaps will promote the wrong policies to solve the very difficult problems that the region is facing. That is why I, as a Mexican and as a former president, really hope that a trade agreement like NAFTA could go further and with other countries in Latin America. I am convinced that if the United States and Chile could reach such a free trade agreement, it would send a tremendously positive signal to the rest of the region in terms of responding to this populistic revival and showing that the way of liberalizing markets with social programs and with the democratic process is no doubt the way of the future for our societies. I try to emphasize this message because the debate is there and we must face the issues head on. Otherwise, these winds may try to succeed within some communities and at the end of the day reverse the improvements that the reforms of the previous decade really brought to the region. Let me finish my brief presentation just sharing with you my belief that in this process of modernization and transformation, and in my book I emphasize, yes, the positive results we had, also the mistakes we made and the insufficiencies that we carried on, that whatever the challenges that Mexico may face today or in the future, we have proved throughout history that we have the capacity as a people to overcome them if we get together, if we unite and build the consensus required to support the politics and the policies that are needed precisely to strengthen the process of transformation. Mexico, no doubt, is a great country, and it will be greater precisely because we Mexicans are determined to build the country that we are so proud of having inherited from our fathers, and the greater country that we will inherit for the benefit of our children. Thank you very much.
First, two quick announcements. I was remiss in not telling you that on the program you noted that Ed Jurigian would welcome you. Ed had to be called out of town, but sends his best regards. Also, second, President Salinas will sign books after the program, and you can find the books on sale out in the lobby. Third, we've got a lot of questions already, but if you do have a burning question and you wish to get it up to me, bring it up to me while I am not asking a question. So I'll begin with the first question. Mr. President, your book focuses on the past, mostly. But what about the challenges for the future for Mexico?
Brief question, but broad subject. When I am asked a question like this one, I am always very respectful of the responsibilities of those who are guiding the exports of Mexico today. That is why I always try to reflect on an answer to such a complex question, thinking not about the next election or administration, but about the next generation. And having that in mind, I would emphasize 4 or 5 fundamental elements as challenges and opportunities for the future. And they show also some of the insufficiencies we left while we were in office. There's still an important problem in the public deficit in Mexico, and the revenue side of the whole equation. And no doubt this is a very important challenge in the many years ahead, precisely to eliminate the fiscal deficit. And I emphasize this because the deficit is like the ocean. When you go to the beach and see the ocean, it's so calm, and you think you can swim there with no problem, and suddenly a wave comes that turns you around and can really sink your head into the sand, and you can drown. Well, the deficit is like that. You think you can tame the deficit if you just have a little bit of it. A little is too much. So, deficit, one part of the challenge. Second, financial reform. Mexican banks today are not lending for Mexico's development. In 1994, after we privatized the Mexican banks, and I know there are many opinions on the process of privatization, and one whole chapter in the book deals with that. After we privatized the banks, they were lending to the private sector the equivalent to 10% of GDP. 6 years later, in the year 2000, the Mexican banks were lending only 1% of GDP. And the reason is that when the banks were bailed out after the crisis of '95, they were bailed out in such a way that there is an stimulus for them not to lend. They were given an IOU from the Mexican government, and the interest they derive from the IOU is so huge that it's easier for them to live from the interest income than from lending to Mexican producers. One single bank derives every year 1.5 billion pesos on interest alone on the IOU, so that bank could actually close down its windows and still thrive very well for its own purposes, but very bad for the Mexican community. So the banks must lend again. Another very important field is rural reform. Agricultural production in Mexico represents only 6% of GDP. 6 cents of every peso or dollar produced in Mexico comes from the rural areas. But 30% of the population live in the small towns of rural Mexico. So there's a tremendous problem of productivity and income distribution as well as efficiency. Rural reform is a tremendous challenge for the future to come. Another one is labor reform. If we liberalize the exchange of goods and services, one must liberalize also the bargaining between enterprises and workers. And that step has to be taken the sooner the better. And last but not least, I'll be very brief in the next answer, last but not least, the rule of law. The rule of law is a huge problem today. The lack of the rule of law is a huge problem today in Mexico, because in the previous administration, the prosecutor's office was used for political persecutions. And that really ruined the process of protecting the security of the citizens, because the nomenclatura, the guys who take charge of the prosecutor's office, took in its hands the security of the citizens and actually kidnapped it. Today, Mexicans feel very unsafe. And this is a problem that the new administration inherited from the previous one. And businesses also demand the strengthening of the rule of law. So I would present this as mere fields of reflection and debate on my case. I'm only one more citizen in my country, but that one that surely attracts the interest and attention of many Mexicans.
There were 4 questions, 3 in Spanish and 1 in English about Pemex. And so I will merge those 4 questions. The question as merged, what about your views on the future of Pemex, and particularly the possibility of privatization of Pemex? I hope I did all of you justice who asked about Pemex.
Well, Mr. President, congratulations on your Spanish, because you merged the question in Spanish into English. By the way, we all students of economic development had to read your books, and I remember, as you mentioned before, while you were professor at Harvard, how you formed many generations of Mexican policy makers. In November of 1990, President Bush and myself sat in Monterrey. This is a city on the northern part of Mexico. Many Mexicans from Monterrey have come here to live in Houston. I met several of them this morning while walking the center of the city. And at Monterrey, we had a very intense dialogue alone on the issue of oil and migration. And President Bush asked for oil to be part of the free trade agreement. And my answer then was that it was not possible, because oil was a part not only of the economic development of Mexico, and also a very important part of its culture. And when I proposed the issue of migration, he responded very responsibly that if NAFTA were to pass, it couldn't go on with another agreement or treaty on migration, because both wouldn't pass a vote in the US Congress. I understood his point of view, and he also was very respectful of mine. That's what I answered then. I still answer the same, but I must also add that after I had this conversation with President Bush, we made important changes within Pemex that allow for private investment, both Mexican and foreign, especially in petrochemicals, and in many other parts of the activity. I believe that within the constitutional mandate that asks for the oil being owned by Mexicans, there is ample room for more participation of private Mexican as well as foreign investors in this very important activity. We have to produce more oil, and more than that, we have to produce more gas, which is so urgent in Mexico and certainly to our neighbor to the north. So I would say that within those constraints, more participation and investment should be welcome.
Very good. And in the process, you answered the next question. So, Mr. President, you talked about the effects of educational opportunities on income distribution. The question is, beyond that, is there hope for the future that the disparities between the richest and the poorest in Mexico might decrease?
This is a very important question, because at the end of the day, what you want with a development program in a country that reaffirms its sovereignty is equality. Not total equality, but improvements in the distribution of income. In the years of populism, it was thought that more state intervention and more state property would bring better income distribution. The reverse happened in reality. The social situation became more polarized, and the people were left in lower standards of living. I tried to prove in my book, and you will see that, I believe, chapter 14, that it is possible to improve income distribution and reduce the number of Mexicans living in poverty when you have sound economic policies and a determined social program. And yes, when you reach price stability through deficit reduction, you recover sustained rates of economic growth, and at the same time, you have a determined social program on educational and rural reform as well as solidarity. The figures that I share with you in the book and which come from the United Nations Economic Development Council and the Central Bank of Mexico, they show that during the 6 years of my administration, income distribution was improved and the number of Mexicans living under poverty were actually reduced. This is surprising because what has been written in the past few years tries to show precisely the reverse situation, that with privatization, a few got very rich and the poor got poorer. Well, this was part of a deliberate strategy that misguided public opinion and was used to try to stop or even reverse those policies, privatization and liberalization. But the facts are here, and they prove that with privatization and liberalization, we were able to improve the index of income distribution in Mexico and reduce the levels of poverty of my countrymen.
Mr. President, this question asks, do you foresee a day in the relevant future when a woman might be president of Mexico?
I would welcome that day. Any candidates here?
Well, I see a few.
That's up to for Mexicans to decide. We have open competitions. We have an electoral process that is respected by everybody. We have a reliable electoral results the same day. And women are making such a strong presence in the political arena, economic activities, social programs, NGOs, political parties that I've always had in my team very important women who play such a relevant job. And I happen to be married to a woman who got a master's degree from Harvard University after coming from National University of Mexico. So I only have respect and admiration for the talent and the beauty of Mexican women.
This is a question from the media. You owe me one, whoever you are. What are your thoughts on President Fox's proposal to relax immigration restrictions on Mexican workers in the United States?
I think this is a very courageous decision from President Fox. And I believe that if we liberalize exchanges in goods and services, it's inevitable that the movement of people should also be liberalized. My personal view, and this is something I expressed to President Bush in Monterrey in 1990, is that we should not go back to the Bracero type program, because that only creates mechanisms in which you may depress actually real wages for workers in the US if you bring temporary workers on that basis from Mexico, and they were open to very bad practices in the municipalities where these workers came from. But the need for these workers in the US economy is there. What I am convinced is that Mexico, and this is what NAFTA was about, should open more employment opportunities so that these courageous Mexicans who take so many risks to come to the US should remain in Mexico, using their talent to allow our country and our economy to grow at faster rates. I understand that it's very difficult to negotiate such an agreement in this very difficult times in which security is of the utmost concern here in the US, and when you have a recession. But sooner or later, this agreement should be reached, the sooner the better.
Okay. Are the results of NAFTA what you expected them to be?
I have to be honest with you, they go beyond what I expected them to be in terms of an increase of trade relations, but they go beyond in another field, and that is the way the US and Mexico relate to each other. And that, I believe, is the most important result of NAFTA. It allowed Mexicans to begin changing their mentalities in the way they look to our very complex and difficult neighbor to the north, and the way the two governments relate as well, more through institutional channels and less through discretionary means. So NAFTA meant, above all, this new type of relationship between our two great countries.
Okay. How do you view the future role of the PRI in Mexico?
Well, it's an opposition party today. It has to work very hard in its process of reorganizing itself and recovering the many votes it lost in the past election. I have emphasized that us former presidents who belong to the party should not tell the party what to do for the future, but that we have to be accountable to the party on what we did as presidents to maintain the party in power democratically. And that's precisely the accountability we have for the party. Many of us pre-members are very looking with great interest to the way it changed its leadership structure for the first time ever through an open election, and 3 million Mexicans went out to vote in this process. It had some irregularities, but the most important thing was that even though the economy is going through an economic recession and that there's all this debate on the party going on today, there were still 3 million people willing to go out and vote in the process of electing its new leadership. So that, no doubt, is an encouraging sign for a party that lost power in the year 2000. Let me tell you just finally that it's common, the so-called conventional wisdom that PRI lost the 2000 election because it had been in power 71 years. First, it's not the same party that was in power all those years. When it was founded in 1929, it was a national front of 29 parties. When it was transformed in 1988 by President Cárdenas, it was a party of vertical structure of sectors. When it was, and it was the period of the fascist expansion in Europe. When it was transformed by President Miguel Alemán in 1946, the military sector was eliminated, and it was the beginning of the Cold War. When we promoted changes to the party during the early 1990s with Luis Donaldo Colosio as president of the party, we had a new international and domestic reality. Let me tell you that in 1994, in a presidential election that was considered fair by international observers, the PRI won the president office, the two chambers of Congress, and the Mexico City. 6 years later, it lost the president's office, the two chambers of Congress, and Mexico City. So, notwithstanding the problems of all those years in power, I think that what most explains the defeat of PRI in the year 2000 are the previous 6 years in power.
Mr. President, the next question says, would you be willing to speculate on the impact of Mexico's economy, the impact on Mexico's economy of China's entrance to the World Trade Organization?
Well, I don't think there's a need to speculate, just to look at the figures, and the figures are very impressive. China is becoming one of the most powerful world economies in the world, and very competitive. I think one should welcome China's presence in WTO, because this great country will have to compete according to the rules established by the WTO. And it's better to face China as a competitor abiding by the rules of WTO than outside of this very important multilateral mechanism. So even though it's a tremendous competitor, welcome. I give the welcome to the presence of China in WTO.
Next to last question. How can liberalization be made more compatible with social justice?
When I spoke about the need to debate the benefits of liberalization in the face of this revival of populism, I did so by always adding the importance of deliberate and committed social programs and the enhancing of the democratic process. And I believe that those three elements together, certainly a liberalization process that goes on for many years, because the continuity of policies here is very important for the process of reform. You cannot have a policy introduced for 5 or 8 years and then the reverse policy coming in its place, because no one of them will have the effects that you are looking for. So continuity of the policies and the participation together of economic decisions, social programs, and political transformations. The three of them together, I'm convinced, will play its role in the process of modernization.
The last question is a statement and a question. Le echamos de menos. We miss you in Mexico. That's a statement. Will you come back to live ever?
I appreciate very much that comment. I just want to let you know that I was last week in Mexico and I was received very warmly by the students at the Universidad Americana, by the professors. And it's been difficult years outside of my country, and difficult also because of the situation, personal, family, and certainly because of the arguments in relation to my administration. But I know that Mexicans have gone through very difficult years of the economic crisis of '95. So my commitment will always be to live in my country. I keep on returning to it more and more often. México es mi casa, México siempre será mi casa.
So, for those of you who are interested, His Excellency will be available for signing books. Thank you all very much for coming. You were a good crowd.